everybody, welcome back to my channel. So the other week I started comfort watching one of my favorite movies of all time, The Mummy from 1999 with Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz. And when I started watching it, I thought, hey, this would actually make a great film to review for my channel. So while I watched it, I took a bunch of notes because, I mean, let's be honest, I've seen it so many times I don't have to give the film my full attention anymore to know exactly what's going on. And today I am going to do a historical accuracy / archaeology review for you guys on the film. I have to preface this by saying that this film has had a huge influence on my pursuit of an archaeological career. What little girl watching that film doesn't want to grow up being a librarian like Evie and married to someone like Rick O'Connell? When I first watched this film when I was 11, I was already well on my way to my fascination with ancient Egypt, and that's one of the reasons I actually watched the film. I also thought that I could learn to speak some ancient Egyptian from the film, which is actually somewhat accurate, which we're going to discuss later on in the video. I've loved this film so consistently that I actually have a couple different copies of the DVD, so it's safe to say that I'm a fan of this movie. Now, as someone who's a bit older and who's taken a bunch of courses on ancient Egypt and who is an archaeologist, I do notice quite a few things in the film that I maybe didn't notice like the first time I started watching it. So I went and did a bit of research on the things that I noticed in the film, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Also, I want to clarify that I know that this film is not striving to be historically accurate in any way, shape, or form. It is meant to be a horror / adventure film. It was written and directed by a guy called Stephen Sommers, but it is interesting to note that they did actually have a consultant Egyptologist to advise them on certain aspects of the film, like the language. Today, I want to look at a bunch of different aspects of the film, what's accurate, what isn't, and what things are perhaps not accurate but are inspired by different parts of ancient Egyptian culture. Just before we get started, don't forget to hit subscribe and the bell button so that you get notified every time I put out new videos, and to help support my channel so I can keep on making content for you guys. Okay, let's dig in. Some of you will know that the 1999 version of The Mummy is a remake of the 1932 horror film The Mummy, which starred the actor Boris Karloff. And the overall premise of these films is that an ancient mummy has been brought back to life by someone accidentally reading a magical text, which is in itself a concept that very much originated in the 20th century, right around the time of the tomb of Tutankhamun being found by Howard Carter. The idea of a resurrected mummy itself would be completely alien to any ancient Egyptian person, and also goes against the entire concept of mummification itself, which was to prepare and preserve the body so that it could enjoy a peaceful afterlife and not come back. The three kind of main ancient Egyptian characters in the film are the Pharaoh Seti, the main villain Imhotep, and his lover / Seti's concubine Anck-su-namun. While this film is 20 years old and I do not hold it necessarily to the same standards that we do today in terms of equality and diversity and inclusion in terms of casting, it is worth noting that the three people who portray these characters in the film are not of Egyptian heritage or descent. Arnold Vosloo, who plays Imhotep, is South African, but he's of Dutch and German heritage. Patricia Velasquez, who plays Anck-su-namun, is Venezuelan, and Aaron Apali, not sure if I'm saying that right, who plays Seti, is Israeli American. So it's kind of a typical Hollywood whitewashing of ancient Egypt. At least one of them is of Middle Eastern descent. It is worth, I think, mentioning that none of the actors are Egyptian. Additionally, these three characters are based on real people, but none of the real people that they're based off of lived at the same time or dynasty. They're kind of like spread out throughout the history of Egypt. Seti I is a pharaoh from the 19th dynasty in the New Kingdom period of ancient Egypt, who ruled about 3,300 years ago, which is roughly correct in the film. They say 3,000. I'm sure they just rounded that down to make it a nicer number. So Seti I ruled at a very interesting time in ancient Egypt. It's basically in the immediate aftermath of the rule of the pharaoh Akhenaten, who kind of flipped the proverbial table on ancient Egyptian religion and caused a lot of chaos. And so his dynasty, the 18th dynasty, ended, and then Seti I is the second pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, who are trying to restore order to Egypt after things went a bit chaotic. He is probably most famous for the fact that he is the father of one of the most famous pharaohs of all time, Ramses II. He died in his 40s, which is relatively young when you consider that his son lived to the ripe old age of 90. And there is no evidence on his mummy that he was stabbed to death by his concubine and priest. I've never really seen him referred to as one of the richest pharaohs. That actually would probably belong to his son Ramses II, if anything, but the New Kingdom itself was a period of quite immense wealth in ancient Egypt, and it's their empire period. It is kind of like the peak of their civilization in a lot of ways. So he definitely would have been a very rich person when we think of like in terms of like gold and stuff like that. The main villain, Imhotep, seems to be roughly modeled on the Old Kingdom Wunderkind extraordinaire priest of the same name, who lived about 1500 years before Seti I. So there's quite a big gap between the two of them. The real life Imhotep was a chancellor to the pharaoh Djoser, as well as being a high priest of the sun god Ra, not Amun as it said in the film. He is probably most famous for the fact that people think that he is the likely architect of the step pyramid of Djoser, which is the first monumental stone pyramid building that we have in ancient Egypt. So basically he is the progenitor of pyramids as a concept in ancient Egypt. And he was actually so famous after he died that he was eventually deified into a god and worshipped by Egyptian people. We don't really know much else about him and his life, and we've never actually found his tomb, but it is suspected that it is somewhere in the Acropolis of Saqqara, which is also where the step pyramid is located. It's also worth mentioning that with the 10 plagues of Egypt that are his like powers in the film are another example of like extreme timeline fudging, which I will try and keep as uncomplicated as possible. So in terms of the 10 plagues of Egypt and the whole story of Moses, there are records of Semitic speaking slaves being present in Egypt. And while an event like the Exodus might have happened, it certainly would have happened on the scale or necessarily exactly the same way that it is portrayed in the Bible. Most people identify Exodus as happening during the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses II and identifies Seti I as being the adoptive father of Moses. So if we consider this, Imhotep having the 10 plagues of Egypt as a curse or power given to him upon the time that he died, it doesn't really make sense if he is a priest of Seti I because it predates Exodus happening. So that stuff wouldn't have happened yet by the time that he died, if that makes any sense. Next we have Anck-su-namun or Nanak-su-namun, they say it a couple different ways in the film, who is the least historical character of the three. I've read a few things that say that her name is based off of the wife of King Tutankhamun, which is Ankh-su-namun. I hope I'm saying that right. Probably not. But other than their name, there was really no similarity between the two people. Ankh-su-namun was a queen of King Tut. Ankh-su-namun is portrayed as a concubine or mistress of King Seti I. So it's a very different relationship. She's not a queen. And while it's entirely possible that Seti might have had a concubine with that name, we don't actually know that. Pharaohs had what we would refer to as harems of multiple women, a couple of which he might have been married to and others of which he wasn't, but were his concubines effectively. And in general, they don't tend to get mentioned in the historical record until they have children or a son who is worth mentioning. One of the things I actually quite like about their portrayal of Anck-su-namun is her costume. I've talked about this briefly in one or two other videos about how, but basically in any film that we see in ancient Egypt, the costuming is always going to be quite off because in modern day, nudity is something that is censored. And in ancient Egypt, it was not, which makes sense when you think about it. They lived somewhere that is very hot. They didn't have air conditioning. They didn't even necessarily have sun cream. And so they didn't have a big need to wear lots of layers of clothing. And nudity to them was not something like taboo or to be hidden. So in this way, the costume that they use for Anck-su-namun in the movie, I think is actually quite good because she's essentially just wearing a loincloth and some body paint, Whether or not that body paint is historically accurate is a debate for another day, but I find it very interesting that she did have quite a skimpy costume, which I think is more accurate than most people would think. So moving on into some more general plot and storyline points, we have also the inclusion of the Magi in the movie, who are portrayed as Pharaoh's like bodyguards who have kept up their traditions down to modern day. The Magi themselves are actually a real historical group who were a semi-nomadic people that arose in Nubia, and by the reign of Seti I, they had become an elite like paramilitary group that functioned within Egypt. They had a bunch of different responsibilities. They were used as a police force, but one of their other duties was to guard the palace and also the tombs of the king. So the movie is actually like quite accurate in portraying them as the guardians of, you know, the tomb and stuff like that. Although the tomb that they're guarding is not that of a pharaoh, it's of a criminal. As I said, they originated in Nubia, which roughly translates to modern day Ethiopia. So you can imagine that I was actually very pleasantly surprised in the opening flashback scene to see a black man portrayed as being a part of this police force. Would they have all necessarily been black by this point? Perhaps not, because you probably would have had other people joining the group to become part of the police force. But I was pleasantly surprised by the fact that they did have the black representation there. The Magi themselves disappear from the archaeological record in the 20th dynasty, so they weren't around for a super long time, and they certainly did not keep up their traditions or as like a secret society or anything up until the 20th century, or else I think we would have probably expected a lot more bloodshed happening when people were starting to excavate the Valley of the Kings. So the main ancient Egyptian setting for the film is, of course, the city of Hamunaptra, which is entirely fictional. So while it is in itself fictional, there are elements of it that tie into ancient Egyptian burial customs, such as the fact that it's probably located on the left bank or the west bank of the Nile. You can infer some of this from the fact that Rick O'Connell talks about how his regiment marched from Libya to Egypt, so that would have been coming from the west, and I don't think that they would have crossed the Nile to do that. So locating the city roughly on the west bank of the Nile, even though they never show the actual location in the film, is true to history. Because the sun sets in the west, ancient Egyptians associated the west bank and that kind of general direction with death. And you will find that all major cemeteries and burial sites in Egypt are located on the west bank of the Nile. So you're talking about Giza, Saqqara, and the Valley of the Kings, for example. There is no single city of the dead in Egypt. The closest kind of parallel to something like Hamunaptra would be the Valley of the Kings, where the pharaohs of the New Kingdom were buried, like Tutankhamun. In terms of where they would mummify people, they recently did actually find evidence of a workshop, like a mummification workshop, at the cemetery of Saqqara in Egypt. Additionally, there was no single like storage place of the wealth of Egypt. So like one big, I guess, safety box. Although, I mean, we just have to look at something like the tomb of Tutankhamun to know that if you were looking for someone where they had a lot of wealth stored, kingly tombs are a pretty good place to start. That being said, having all the wealth of Egypt concentrated in one place is just like a bad idea from a security standpoint. Not to mention the fact that like wealth in general is recycled throughout generations as it is today. So they had no real reason to have it all just like sitting in one spot and not using it. It would have been distributed like throughout the kingdom. We also have, as a little like mini villain in the film, the flesh-eating scarab beetles, which again are true and not true. In real life, there is not a breed or version of scarab beetles that eat on human flesh. Scarab beetles literally eat poo. That they are dung beetles, and they were revered by ancient Egyptians, but they were not feared by them in terms of they are going to eat me alive if I disturb them. Although, that being said, there is a spell in the Book of the Dead that is to protect yourself from Upshai, which is a scarab beetle that threatens to eat the flesh of the mummy who is traveling through the underworld. So I think that's probably where they got the inspiration for using this little creature in the films. Speaking of books, we obviously have to discuss the magical texts texts in the film that kind of kick off the whole plot, basically, of the mummy rising from the dead. The Book of Amun-Ra, which is the gold book, the Book of Life, it's called in the film, is entirely fictional and was made up for the purposes of the film. But, as some of you will know, the Book of the Dead is actually a real thing in ancient Egypt, although not in the way that it's portrayed in the film in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't even exist in a format or a way that we would call like a book. It's more of like a collection of text, but how we think of things, it's easiest to just refer to it as a book. If we are to translate its actual name, it roughly equates to the Book of Coming Forth by Day, or the Book of Emerging Forth into the Light. Basically, it is a collection of spells which are meant to help guide the deceased through the underworld as they travel through it on their way to be judged and then to pass into the paradise of the afterlife, which is also sometimes known as the Field of Reeds. So it's less like a book in terms of like has a story, a plot, and blah, 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 and more like a cheat sheet for getting into heaven. We do have copies of these texts that make of the book written on papyri that we have found, but it is also commonly inscribed on the sarcophagus and I think sometimes the tombs of the deceased, which is actually kind of mentioned in the film when they first find the sarcophagus of Imhotep, and Evie talks about how the spells have been scratched off of the sarcophagus, which in itself is a very interesting point because that is something that you would probably do for someone that you want to screw over, because it means that they've lost their guidebook for getting into the afterlife and would then, I guess, theoretically be cursed to wander through the underworld or get eaten by the creature Apophis, which devours undeserving souls. Speaking of sentencing a criminal in the afterlife, we have the Hamdai curse, which is, again, a big plot point for the film. This is a major plot hole, very noticeable, especially for anyone who has studied ancient Egypt and or their relationship with death and what they thought about it. First of all, living forever in the afterlife is what all ancient Egyptians aspired to do when they died. So it doesn't make sense to punish a criminal or a treasonous person who killed a pharaoh like Imhotep with a curse of immortal life. One article that I read when I was researching for this video said that it was basically akin to punishing a thief by making him a billionaire, just to give you some perspective. Additionally, mummification itself is like a costly, time-consuming process, which is done to ensure that people's entire body can reach the afterlife. So you would not waste that on a criminal like Imhotep or Anaxunamun. A more fitting punishment for them, which obviously would have meant that we wouldn't have had the film, would have been to desecrate their bodies or scratch the spells off the sarcophagus or not even bury them at all, like leave them out exposed somewhere and have them get picked over by vultures. That being said, I did read that the way in which they mummified Imhotep in the movie when they're wrapping the linen around him is actually quite accurate. We don't know exactly, we don't have like a guide on exactly how they wrapped mummies, but we can infer from the bandages that we can still see in modern day. So apparently they did a very good job with representing that. Also, Evie's description of how you would stick a poker up someone's nose and kind of pull their brains out through their nostrils when you're removing soft tissue is also quite accurate to how they would have done it in ancient times. They also do remove a bunch of your other organs and do put them in canopic jars as well for preservation. But in ancient Egypt, they only had 4 jars, not 5 as portrayed in the movie. Obviously in the movie, they have 5 for the 5 people that are going to get eaten by Imhotep at some point, so that was all part of the plot. So next we're going to talk about the language in the film. If you remember at the beginning I said that I watched the movie enough times that I was trying to learn some ancient Egyptian from the film, which in retrospect now, knowing what I know about language, is silly, but I was 11, whatever. I think the only word I could ever consistently figure out was nai, which was like no. Well, that being said, the language in the film is actually quite accurate. For the ancient Egyptian dialogue in the film, they brought in Egyptologist Dr. Stuart Tyson Smith, who did some work to recreate to them how ancient Egyptian would have sounded as a language about 3,000 years ago. He did this using a variety of different methods because, despite what you might think, it's not as easy as putting the hieroglyphs in the correct order and just reading them out. When you do that, it sounds like quite flat. It doesn't sound like a language. It doesn't have tone. It doesn't have intonation. So how we say ancient Egyptian words today is not the same as how they would have said it back then. He used a bunch of different ways to try and reconstruct how this language would have sounded, including Coptic, which is an Egyptian language, which is the language of Coptic Christians in Egypt, and is probably one of the closest languages to ancient Egyptian that still exists today and is still spoken. He also looked at cuneiform tablets that are copies of Egyptian texts, and we know how those cuneiform sounds would have sounded. He also looked at how we pronounce and speak Afro-Asiatic languages that would have been similar to ancient Egyptian. In doing my research for this video, I read a really interesting article about his process. He's also worked on the Stargate film TV franchise, doing ancient Egyptian for them, and so there is a magazine article about it, which I have linked in the description box below if you'd like to read it. I definitely recommend it. I found it very interesting. All right, so one of the last things I'm going to talk about as well is kind of like Evie and her portrayal. One of the best parts of the film for me is when Rick steals a toolkit to give to Evie, and she opens it and you do get a shot of it in the film, and it's a really great archaeological toolkit. I would like to have that toolkit. She's got a trowel, she's got brushes, she's got lots of little different tools for doing things. So I really love that they included that shot in the film. Even if you don't necessarily see her using the tools so much, the fact that she has them is good enough for me. I'm always, I don't know if I want to say disappointed, but I'm really curious as to why they chose to have her call herself a librarian in the film instead of an archaeologist or an Egyptologist. It's pretty clear that that's what her parents were. She is very much pursuing an archaeological adventure, so to speak, or archaeological artifacts in the film. Perhaps she would maybe be more specifically an epigrapher, so like somebody who looks at ancient languages as opposed to someone who's necessarily doing lots of digging. Archaeology and archaeologists did exist by the 1920s. Also, one of the things that really confused me every time I watched the film is when she referred to Bembridge scholars, and I always thought that that was kind of like a weird reference that I didn't really understand until I moved to the UK and I heard people talking about Oxbridge, which is an amalgamation of the names of the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, which have two very prestigious archaeological and Egyptology departments. So clearly Bembridge is, I don't know, the film kind of rewriting that but not referring to an actual real university. I don't know why they would have used that instead of Oxbridge. I mean, nobody who doesn't live in the UK or who isn't in those circles doesn't even know what that means anyway, so I guess it doesn't really matter. Okay guys, I think I've got to stop it there, or else this video is going to go on for way longer than it probably should have. Thank you for persevering if you've made it to the end of this video. I obviously could go on and really pick this movie apart, but these are kind of the main big things that I noticed that I thought were worth mentioning. Despite all of the stuff that I've mentioned about it, this is actually probably my favorite archaeological movie that I've ever watched. I like Indiana Jones, but I love this film and I would always recommend watching it. The music, the plot, the costumes, the acting, everything about this film, I love. It's magical. Just go watch it. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, or anything to add to the conversation, please put them down in the comment section below. If you want to support me in the channel, please subscribe and hit the bell button so that you get notified every time I put out new videos. If you'd like, I have started a new archaeology themed Instagram. So I've got links to that and my Twitter down below if you're interested in following me on other social media. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. I'll see you guys next time. Bye!